Hello and welcome to the 3D Blu-ray Bunker. This is a place for us die-hard fans of 3D where we exclusively look at 3D Blu-rays, not to review the film but to almost entirely focus on the quality of the 3D on offer, with just a short comment at the end about the film itself. And today we're looking at The Legend of Hercules, Renny Harlin's film from 2014. This was the second of two Hercules films that came out that year. The other one starred Dwayne Johnson, and this one has Kenan Lutz as the hero. These two films are the only pair of so-called twin films that I can think of where they were both released in 3D, and whereas the other one was post-converted 3D, this was shot in native 3D, and the aspect ratio is 2.4:1. And the opening shots of 3D films often set out their stall by giving you an idea of how seriously they're going to take the 3D, and this one is an absolute tour de force of fantastic 3D. It's presented as a single continuous take, beginning underwater during a battle with bodies and weapons falling towards us, and then the camera moves up out of the water and it passes through the oars of the ships here. And whilst this looks like it's maybe not top-notch CG, it's a great camera move for 3D, and it gets even better as we move on through the beach landing to the fight where spears and fireballs are hurled towards us. They've gone from the fantastic depth of the oars stretching deep into the frame onto this stuff popping out of the screen, all in the same shot, which continues on through this burning roof of a building and onto the ranks of massed troops. I'm going to say that from a 3D point of view, this is firmly amongst the greatest opening shot of any 3D film that I've seen. It's spectacular stuff, and it's really reassuring that this film's in the hands of people who seem to care quite a lot about the 3D. I'll get some of the minor negatives out of the way first. I did notice a couple of 2D shots in the film. There's this one here, which is pushed behind the plane of the screen, presumably in the hope that it won't be noticed, but this one is right on the plane of the screen, so its flatness is quite apparent. The rest of this scene is all fine in 3D, but for this shot I guess they had to actually put a camera in the water, and maybe their 3D rig was either too awkward to operate there, or perhaps more probably they wanted to avoid it getting splashed, because I think that water on just one of the lenses would ruin the shot for 3D. Also, there's this shot of a net on top of a gladiator, which looks a bit odd. I can't work out exactly what the problem is, because it looks like her face is above the net, which obviously shouldn't happen, not if it was just a straightforward native shot. But it also looks like the net is maybe digital, which might explain the fault, but a digital net does seem a little bit extravagant and unnecessary. There are some other moments where CG sits alongside the natively shot live action and it doesn't look 100% correct, and the CG is also generally of a relatively low standard compared to big budget films, but I don't think any of it's too horrible. Everything else, though, is pretty great, really. The most impressive thing in the film, I think, is the amount of effort they look like they went to compose for 3D, because shot after shot is extremely well arranged to show off the stereoscopy, from simple stuff like the veils hanging down on this bed in the scene where Roxanne McKee from Game of Thrones gets her visitation from Zeus. These veils make the 3D so much more interesting in the scene, and to larger things like facing down these pillars, classic 3D composition, which is something they managed to do with a majority of the interior shots, like the doors in the foreground here framing the shot as the camera moves on in through them, or there's this superb ship interior with the rows of rowers, as well as the structure of the ship. It's brilliant design, and people in cages behind bars is always something that should look good in a 3D film. All of this composition wouldn't really count for much if the stereographer didn't want to make the most of it, and the person in question here was a guy called Peter Burland, who seems to be very keen on placing his lens separation at pretty much the maximum I think he'd get away with for most shots. There's never any question here that you're watching a 3D film, and clearly it's one where everyone was embracing the process and getting the most out of it. This features so many great 3D shots I can only scratch at the surface here. There's stuff like this that goes from deep into the screen to quite a way out in front of it. It looks like Bowman seemed to make great characters for 3D movies, as there's clearly more than one excellent viewpoint for them. Something that Renny Harlin does several times is use that ramping effect where the speed changes within a shot from normal speed to slow motion. And this was something that I think 300 got lots of praise for a few years earlier, but by the time of this film it was probably thought of as a little bit cliched. But I think that the ramping here is actually quite more than just copying a hackneyed old idea, because it's really useful in the context of 3D as it allows them to slow down the action for a pop-out moment, making that pop-out much more effective, like this sword here in slow motion. There's a fantastic hyper stereo view of this place. This is my favourite type of 3D, so for me it's one of the nicest shots in the film. Presumably nothing to do with their native photography on this occasion, as I guess it's entirely digital, but it's a really lovely view. And this view appears a few times in the film, and I thought it was a bit of a shame that they only go hyper stereo with it just this once. I always tend to mention complex vegetation, as it's usually something that looks way better in a natively shot film than in a converted one, so it's good to see this scene where you can make out the placement of every leaf in 3D space, or here where every blade of grass can be clearly made out. It's not an obvious 3D thrill shot, but I find it incredibly pleasing in its own little way. This scene is an example of the kind of thing that frequently trips up converted 3D, because the camera's circling around the two of them, and whilst it looks fine here, being natively shot, it's the kind of camera movement where in a post-converted film you can get that weird warping effect where the changing depth placement doesn't match the changing camera angle. I also tend to mention low-level shots like this where the plane of the ground, or water in this case, stretches from the foreground to the background. It's a shot that I think maybe works at its best when the subject is in the background like it is here. It's another really nice shot. Another very cool thing that Renny Harlin does for the benefit of the 3D is to frequently fill the frame with floating particles. So there are several scenes when petals and seeds and stuff float about, sometimes behind the screen, sometimes in front, and the effect is frequently fantastic. I guess that rain counts as an airborne particle too, and there's some of that in the film as well. It's always looking good, and you can see that it's very nicely lit rain, and shot here so that the streak of each raindrop is captured superbly. Even better is when he throws the rain into slow motion, so whilst having shallow depth of field here with just Hercules in focus, this is a shot that you wouldn't normally expect to look good in 3D, but the rain makes it look incredible. There's a really effective shot where the villain approaches someone stealthily, and the shot progresses with him just being seen in silhouette in the darkness, but then a flash of lightning reveals him close up and his face is fully lit, popping out of the screen. And maybe this is another sort of fairly cliched shot, but again, seeing it done in 3D makes all the difference. During the arena fight sequence, there's something that I've not seen in any previous Gladiator film. Maybe I haven't seen enough of them, but in the ones that I have seen, the floor of the arena is generally flat and covered in sand. But instead of that, here the fight takes place across these connected pillars, which is both brilliant for making the fight more exciting, but also brilliant, of course, for 3D. It looks good throughout the scene, and great when we get to this shot, where again the sense of depth helps the drama of the moment in a really significant way. Same sort of thing with this cliff climbing scene where the height is massively amplified by seeing it in 3D. It's one of those moments where if you quickly close one eye to see how the film would look in 2D, the view loses virtually all of its power. Finally, I love this shot of the stars. There's a vast amount of depth and separation in between each star. I'm not sure if that's the constellation of Hercules. It would have been a very clever touch if it was. But it's logically ridiculous, as it would require a distance between the lenses to be sort of measured in multiple light years, I think. But I'm glad they've done it here, and it looks awesome. So, how about the film itself? Well, if you've read anything about it, or perhaps if you've seen the thing, you might be wondering why I've just spent several minutes praising one element of it, because pretty much everywhere you look, this has terrible reviews. And I genuinely feel a little bit sorry for Renny Harlin here, as I can honestly imagine him coming out of the final edit with his 3D glasses on, believing that he's just put together a great fun film with superb 3D, and that he was really sitting on a winner. But what happened was, the film came out, and everyone hated it, and obviously no mainstream reviewer ever gives any special mention to the quality of the 3D. Now, I know I've often got quite poor taste in films, but I really just don't get why this was so unpopular. First of all, it's a very different film to the Dwayne Johnson one, even though, like that film, this goes its own way with the story, which I suppose if you're a Greek classicist you won't approve of, but then I don't imagine many Greek classicists would be interested in Renny Harlin films, or 3D films, or listening to this for that matter. There's plenty obviously wrong with it, from its often poor CG, its no longer fashionable speed ramping technique, maybe some of the acting, but in spite of all of that, I thought it was quite good fun, with some appropriately scenery-chewing performances from the bad guys, and likeable enough leads in Kellen Lutz, Gaia Weiss, and Liam McIntyre of Spartacus fame. The story's not brilliant, but it's okay, and it moves along at a reasonable pace, and given the comparatively low budget for this type of film, I think a lot of it looks pretty good. I do think the other Hercules film was ultimately a much better movie, but I think this film understands that it is total hokum, and it's a far more enjoyable film than all of those scathing reviews give it credit for. And more relevantly, from the point of view of this channel, the 3D is excellent. So I'd say that it definitely deserves a place in your 3D Blu-ray collection, right alongside the Dwayne Johnson one. So I hope you found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you'll join me again for another 3D Blu-ray review. Until then, thanks for looking in on this one. Cheers for now. Bye-bye.